All right. Good evening. Welcome back to the Social Distance Powwow page, specifically our Women Empowerment page show. My name is Jessie Taken Alive-Rencountre. I'm a Hunkpapa Lakota. I come to you uh, from the Black Hills of South Dakota. We have another powerful, empowering show. Two of our wonderful, beautiful matriarch guests again back with us for our third show in this series. And if you were paying attention to our last two shows, you were probably able to hear some amazing educational information that was able to hopefully start you or help you continue on your healing journey. I want to be able to make sure that you are able to put some questions into the chat box there. And we want to be able to have this show as an interactive show. And so we want to be able to answer some questions that you might have from the past two shows or even today that we might have as well too. So I'm going to introduce our first guest here tonight. We have the amazing Katsi Cook. Katsi is a wonderful lady who has started a wonderful program called the Spirit Aligned Leadership Program, where they highlight and help out many matriarchs across Indigenous country throughout Turtle Island. And I'm going to go ahead and let her introduce herself again, and then we'll go on to our next guest.
Sego sewa guego, Tekachichakwa Yungyat. I'm speaking to you from my Mohawk community of Akwesasne. I just wanted to welcome you with a little bit of a translation of the song segment you just heard from the Kahnigo Rio singers here at Akwesasne. It's the Women's Power Song, sung in the ritualization of our young women and many other wonderful uh, spiritual contexts for healing. Uh, the words mean women have good minds. Yunkwani Kohrio, Neagungwe. The women have good medicine. Yungwatnugatsario. The women have a lot of strength. Yungwatsastasarayo. And so this song sings particularly about the generations and representing the teachings passed down from the women. So I just wanted to open with that thought of women's power. To.
Yes. Pilamaye Gaji, thank you for that powerful interpretation of that beautiful song. We want to go over to our next guest as well too. We have actually a relative of Gaji's. I believe they're sister cousins, Miss Beverly Cook, and Beverly was is is an amazing educator with us and helping us learn about trauma, what it does to us, to our bodies, how it impacts us as a whole, as a society as well too. And if you were able to join us in our last two sessions with amazing Gaji and Beverly, you were able to hear some of this amazing information that she was sharing with us about trauma. And so we want to be able to answer some of those questions that might have came through on episode 1 and episode 2. But I want to go ahead and turn it over to Miss Beverly. She can introduce herself as well too and tell you a little bit about where she comes from.
Thank you. Sego Zewa Guego. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be back here. I'm Beverly Cook. I'm a elected tribal chief in the Mohawk territory of Akwesasne. I'm also a family nurse practitioner and a mother, grandmother. And what I talk about is what my experience has been, what my experience with the community has been. So the last two sessions, we covered a lot of material and we weren't able to go real deep into everything, but that's what this session is for people to ask questions. Maybe something struck them or they heard something that they would like to know more about. But for those who weren't able to see the first two sessions, we began by covering our earliest beginnings and some of the ways that our developing body and nervous system could be impacted by the experiences of our mothers while she carried us in her womb, and how her experiences also impacted the DNA that we carried as baby girls in our eggs, that we had inside of our bodies from the times we were about 5 months old in our mother's womb. So the influences of our mother's experiences are powerful, and it's good for us to be aware of how powerful that is, and how to make sense of it in our own lives. We also spoke about how, as children, our experiences could change the way we would view the world and the people in it, and how the experiences that we had influenced the way our brains developed as we grew, making us maybe fearful, anxious, angry, or resilient, patient, and thoughtful people, or some combination of all of that. We talked about epigenetics and how our experiences could change the way our genes inside of our cells in our DNA express themselves, making us who we are, who we've become in response to nurturing by our parents or family members, or by being ignored or rejected or even harmed.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if we discussed how the power of our ancient grandmothers' prayers and their life-giving power is in all of our cells. Because we talked in between our sessions, so I'm not sure if we just talked about it or if we talked to you all about it. But how I think of it as a prayer anyway. But it's how our grandmother's influence all through time keeps us alive through our mitochondria, where our DNA belongs to them. So that's a little bit confusing, but it's something that I think is real important for women to have a grasp of, how we really do sustain life. We also talked about adverse childhood experiences and the negative effects on our health across the lifespan, and not just our physical health, but our mental, emotional, and spiritual health as well. And we talked about our immediate reactions to trauma. For instance, if we encounter an overwhelming threat and we land in a fight or flight or freeze response, and there's also a fawn response, and how supportive, loving adults are the antidote to that permanent wounding that could happen to us of our spirits, and the importance of the relaxation response that allows us physically and emotionally to reset, as opposed to continually walking on eggshells, for instance. We spoke briefly about how finding the bodies of the children at the boarding schools opened up some wounds for all of us, and especially of those who survived the boarding schools, and the generations of us that followed, and how we were impacted by that. So the scars we carry from abandonment or rejection, or not feeling we're good enough, or our loss of attachment, just to name a few, those are just some feelings of resulting from something we might not even recognize as a trauma. But how that discovery of those children kind of refreshed our page in that regard, where we had a lot of emotion that some of us didn't really know what to do with that. So we didn't go real deep into that, but I think some of the questions that come of all of the things that we discussed is, why do we search for connection and acceptance and belonging and inclusion and safety, and how do we return to wholeness if we're not already there? How do we get there? So I think that kind of winds up what we talked about in the last couple sessions.
Yes, thank you for that recap. Wonderful information that we were able to share in those first two episodes. I want to go to our viewers that we have logged in now. I want to give some shout outs to people who are joining us. Please let us know where you're joining us from, if you're representing a tribe and such, and also if you were able to tune in to the past two episodes, what questions might you have for Gaji and Beverly to help us with this learning about trauma and healing from the trauma. So I'm going to go ahead and, open it up to some questions that we might have. Also, just to give some shout outs to some of our audience right now. We have some viewers that are viewing with us live right now. And we're so happy to have you on joining us. Don't be afraid to say hello. We want to be able to recognize you. And thank you for joining us in this cyberspace that we have right now. So I don't have access to see who is on viewing right now, but so you will have to go ahead and put your tribe or just say hello in the comments to let us know who you are, where you're joining us from. So while we're waiting for that, one of the questions, are one of the things that we always like to say when we talk about this important, but also can be sensitive topic is that we want people to be aware that um, it is an important conversation, but sometimes it might bring up some feelings. But even with that, going into the topic of what a trigger is. So while we're waiting for some people to interact with us as well too here on SDP, I want to go ahead and ask Beverly, how would you explain what a trigger is? And how do we even know if we've been triggered from trauma?
Yeah, I think sometimes we don't even realize that we've been traumatized. And how I learned about it was that it's like you kind of judge yourself. I'm not this enough. I'm not that enough. I'm not. And when you start to inquire within yourself, where does that come from? I think the feelings lead you to where that trauma may lie. And even though when we did the ACE study, there were those 10 different categories. And out of the 10 categories, it didn't mean that you had to have been beaten every day. It could be something like having an alcoholic in the family, but maybe you had enough food on the table and maybe you had things that you needed, but maybe you didn't have the attention that you sought. And over an entire childhood, that could create a feeling of unworthiness inside of a child. And so that's a particular kind of trauma in itself. But the triggers are situations, things that you may be listening to, situations that you might walk in on, something that you might read about that raise in you feelings of despair, or maybe feeling anxious, or feeling unsure of yourself, negative self-talk. Like that reminds me of me. I can never get anything right, and you start talking badly about yourself. So the triggers could be anything, any situation that raises that emotion that is uncomfortable for you. And so it might be something like an anniversary of a loss or a traumatic event that did occur, something on the news, just the fact of feeling overwhelmed a particular day where you can't seem to get anything done, or there's so much to do that you feel like you don't know where to start, and then you get overwhelmed. And sometimes people isolate. And there's a saying in recovery programs: don't let yourself get hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, because it's a perfect setup for relapse. So there's certain situations that raise emotions that are uncomfortable, and what to do about them is the other side of it. And I think that's when you get into your recovery, you start to pick up tools. And for myself, I can get myself into, um, feeling very anxious, worried about my kids, and I can go over the cliff sometimes. But I've learned to pray about it. And by the time I'm done praying about it, my heart rate is back down again. My respirations are back to normal. My thinking is more clear. I've handed it over to the Creator, and then I can move on from there. So sometimes calling someone, for support, somebody to talk with. Some people journal, and write all their feelings out in the journal, or taking a walk. Um, Plenty of things to learn to do and when those episodes occur.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to give some shout outs to some of our live viewers that we have right now. I want to say hello to Leonore. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And we have the infamous Gail Smalls here with us. Also, one of the executive directors, maybe, of Spirit of Mind program. Thank you for joining us tonight, Gail. I want to say hello to Patricia also. And from Leonore is from Guatemala. So thank you for joining us all the way from Guatemala. Patricia is from Treaty 6 territory up in Saskatchewan, way up north. So a relative up north of us. Hello to Tamaris from the Lummi Nation. We have a couple of questions here. Hello to Blith George. I hope I'm pronouncing that Blith correctly. But we have a couple of questions here, Beverly and Gaji. So one question coming in from Lenore is it is part of the process in the healing? Is it part of the process in the healing? Um, is it feeling sad or bad? Is that part of the healing?
Good question.
Mm-hmm.
I think the part of the healing often is following that bad feeling or that sad feeling, that uncomfortable feeling, say, instead. Slowly and gently to its source. And it can take a while, not something that has to happen all at once. But I think that eventually the goal, the relief and release of that feeling is the grieving of it. And I think that it should have a name by the time that you're at the point where you can actually grieve it. Whatever that loss is, whether it was the loss of your innocence or the loss of a loved one, or whatever the traumatic event was, or the perceived loss of the love of your parent, or something like that. There can be many sources of events, sources that create a feeling of blaming. Self-blame is another one. And getting to that is I think it's a slow, systematic process. Allowing some of that uncomfortableness to rise up and feel it, grieve it, and then let it go. And one of our sisters that we work with in the community talks about walking through the storm. In order to get on the other side of it, you've got to head into it and not away from it, because it'll always be chasing you. It'll always be, nipping at your ankles, and at some point you have to turn around and charge right through it in order to get on the other side. So everybody's different, though. But I think that having support is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thank you. I really love that about going into the storm. That's a really good way to kind of take a look at it. When you were talking, when you're answering, great question, though, by the way, to audience. When I was thinking about it, you kind of compare it to like when we have trauma to our bodies. If we get a big cut, it is painful even after the initial cut. It is painful when it is healing, and you're always going to have that scar there. But it does take time as well too. So.
Mhm.
We're going to go into our next question. We looks like we have some more viewers on as well too. Welcome to the Spirit Aligned Social Distance Powwow live show tonight with Beverly and Gudgy. If you missed the beginning part, we are talking and doing some recaps, answering some questions from our first two episodes that we had referring to trauma. So we have some more questions here I want to get to. We wanted to make this like a live interactive question answer Q&A session today because there was some great feedback from the first two episodes. I'll go to another question. We have, let's see, Miss Blith George. So her question is, so many therapy models encourage no contact with those who may have hurt you in the past. For example, like your parents and siblings. This doesn't seem compatible with what we know about family violence, recovery, and generational coping mechanisms. How do you how do we heal together across generations, and where do we go for help to do so?
Mm.
Well, certainly there are professionals that people can go to. I think that it's not always just one modality that helps us get there. I think that also our ways kind symbolize that coming together, that support network that we all need. And even if we're all individually working on our own issues, the fact that we're not alone and we're not the only one is is really important. My experience, say with recovery programs, at some point there may be a time when you can approach an somebody that's offended against you, or you can approach parents, that had a particular parenting style that you need to, or you feel that you need to talk about with them. Uh, that's not always easy, depending on which generation you're dealing with. And I don't know if Gudgy has any feelings about that or not. In going back to the original person that caused the trauma in the first place. I'm not sure that I have a good answer for that one.
It's a struggle with the emotion and the material. One of the markers of trauma to me is that there's a basic rewiring of a nervous energy, of your nervous pathways, and sets into motion a pattern of behavior that emerges from the initial trauma, but over time becomes a pattern of behavior that's not helpful to you in reaching a sense of goals. And so the idea of confronting or sharing space with, one of the things about our ceremonies is this idea of you leave it at the door. And it's true that the internal struggle of ceremonial work can help surface a way to, in the individual, to reconstruct meaning around the event. And if this is assuming a journey of healing that's always going to be fraught with that internal struggle with emotion and I think that at some point, as you begin to touch those spaces in you and begin to acknowledge the pattern of behavior that's not helpful to you. Of course, the classic is addiction, but even say in a medical trauma, a surgery that was totally unexpected, that was some kind of tissue gone awry in your body, something you didn't cause. Um, we know how ubiquitous anxiety is in society right now and in our children. And so that pattern of anxiety may also be attached to that original trauma. So that's a tough one to figure how to. The families usually get estranged, right, in such a circumstance. They can't, the positions they're in are just so different. But I still nevertheless encourage you to look for that place inside of yourself to recognize any of the uh, how deep do those behavior patterns that are not helpful to your life, how deep are they going and how do they affect other relationships? It's all I got.
Thank you. Great answers. I want to give a shout out to Ruby Stacy, who's joining us as well too. Ruby has a comment that she put on there too, a comment/question, and it kind of ties together the first part of this question with the original question that you guys just answered. So we kind of answered this one already. So Ruby says, "I'm curious. Is it necessary or even our responsibility to return to the pain or trauma to heal?" Then she goes on and says, what is our responsibility when we are thinking of intergenerational healing?
Mm-hmm.
So I know that as a group here in our small group, we had actually addressed this, which is, a great question. And I think a lot of people have brought this question up as well too, especially over the last, 9 months or so. Everything with the media, the coverage that like boarding schools has been getting, and we kind of start asking ourselves as Indigenous people, like, what is my role in the healing of intergenerational trauma? Um, I'll give it to whoever would like to answer that wonderful question, Gaji or Beverly.
So I think there's a responsibility in if we take a look at ourselves and how we personally do or do not perpetrate that trauma on inside of our own families, especially with our own children. How do we recognize that? Do we recognize how we're conducting our child rearing, and where does some of those practices come from? And that's not to say that everybody does a bad job, raising their children, but do we recognize where those instances are that we withhold our love when we send a child off to the corner or send them to timeout, and from their point of view, what does that feel like? Is a 4-year-old really learning anything from timeout other than I must be bad, I must have done something bad, my mom doesn't love me anymore, from the way that they look at situations? And do we perpetrate that over and over again in different forms as they grow older? I think those are the things that are our responsibility, where to step in. And I think when we do that, we learn something about ourselves, and it's possible to learn where that came from. How did I learn to do that? How did I learn to react that way? Where do my feelings come from? And then that's when we start to turn around and look at what it was that occurred to us. So in that regard, I think there's some responsibility. And it wasn't until my husband, through my husband, I saw how that, if you're going to be talking about boarding schools, how that harm came from that school through his grandfather to his father, and then on to him in the way that he was parented, and the addiction that was in the home, and the lack of emotion and the lack of affection, the all of the, when you look at the ACE study, you start to tick off all these things that occurred in that family. And then you can have my own family where nobody went to boarding school, but there were issues inside of the home, rage and a workaholic father, and who was doing everything that he could to take care of his family, but was absent a lot. And so there's all kinds of things in each of us that form who we are, how we react to situations, and how we react to our children. So in that regard, if we're going to stop a cycle, we absolutely have responsibility to look at where we come from ourselves.
That's a really great response. Gaji, would you like to add anything to that, or do you want to go on to the next question?
Let's go on to the next question. I
Okay.
Answer, Bev.
Okay. We also have some viewers live as well too on our Instagram page with Spirit Align. I want to welcome our guests on there as well too. We have some questions from that Instagram page as well too. As you can see, we're live streaming from a few different sites right now, so we're trying to get through all the questions from our viewers. So we have a question coming in on the Instagram page. The first one is, how do we get out of that mindset of believing the trauma you've experienced is your fault? It's a really good question. I think a lot of people tend to do that when we experience trauma, believing that, hey, if I didn't do this, this wouldn't have happened. We kind of start blaming ourselves and become really hard on ourselves, sometimes just as hard as the traumatic experience itself. So how do we get out of that mindset? Is that question of believing that trauma is our fault.
Sometimes that is the trauma. There's the event, and then there's everybody's reaction to it, or our own reaction to it. And that's another shame-based thinking that comes from way back, in our childhood. But that, I think there's mechanisms that dealing with trauma. There was a technique that was used by a friend of mine, trauma incident reduction, where there was special attention paid to the actual incident itself, recounted over and over again from the perspective of the person who was harmed. And until there was a reconciling of the circumstances, and how would I know? How would I know that that was a dangerous place to be, or how would I know that this event would occur, or so that there's some reconciling to it. But it, that's not a easy one to just switch. Flip the switch. That will take some work and some looking back at some of the things that Gaji said, like patterns of thinking that we've been trained into thinking. And I think there's lots of examples of how that way of thinking is imposed upon us. And it could be even religious organizations that help to fuel that kind of thinking, that we're faulty, we're I don't get too much into religion, but sometimes that it can be a participant in creating that feeling of guilt or shame.
Right. Yeah. Great response.
There's a power imbalance inherent in the context of the trauma. But I just wanted to add that in this era of decolonization and reconciliation, that the very concept of sin is for the purpose of social control. And so this idea of blame and shame comes from, I think, what Beverly was talking about, the oppression of the religious, the ideology of progress, that in order to advance our humanity, we need to subscribe to a particular process of domination and control. And so a lot of the shaming and blaming of Indigenous women have come from the ideas of this concept of sin.
Right. I think that's so true. I think a lot of people get stuck in that of feeling bad and really not like, just like Beverly said too, when she first started answering that, is like sometimes that is the trauma itself, right? Is that self-blame and, you know, being so hard on yourself, not forgiving yourself for that happening, right? So great answers, ladies. We have another question. It says, what are some tips to help realize where my trauma is coming from? You know, while our ladies think about that too, I think when we think about it, I think everybody, no matter how good of a life you live, everyone has some sort of trauma to some degree. And some of us carry more trauma than some of us. And some of our trauma might be experienced from going to school. Some of it might be watching something that we witnessed on TV or in a video. In some sort of way, in some aspect, we have all experienced trauma. And so this question, you know, it's a really good question. It's about how do we find out or what are some tips to help realize where my trauma is coming from? That's a big question. It's a good one too.
The tool of the ACEs is one of the best tools that Bev talked about in the first session. Bev, maybe you can refresh along that line.
Yeah, for those that didn't get to hear about that, the ACE study just picked 10 a combination of household dysfunction and actual abuse and neglect. So there was physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and then there was physical and emotional neglect. And then if you lived in a household where addiction was an issue, mental health, someone had perhaps attempted or completed suicide, witnessing your mother being physically abused, having somebody be incarcerated, and having your parents separate or divorce. And this is all everything that you may have experienced between birth and the age of 18. And so thinking about those things, they could be something major or they could be something minor. And take emotional neglect, which you might think, you know, it's maybe not that bad, or emotional abuse, you know, well, at least it's not as bad as sexual abuse. But in the context of this study, they found that actually the most negative impacts came from the emotional abuse of a child by their parent, more than any of the other abuses or dysfunction, which kind of makes sense because it goes to the real core of you and your psyche and your self-worth. And you can imagine where self-blame and, you know, loss of self-esteem and loss of self-confidence originates. So looking at that list, you can begin to see where, gee, you know, all this while I thought I had a normal home. You know, I thought I had a normal childhood. I had a bike. You know, I had, you know, clean clothes and things like that. But there's those underlying experiences that we have that could be one great big mother of a beating that we took, or, you know, a sexual assault, or it could be day in and day out being called down or being made to feel unsure of yourself or not good enough, or you never amount to anything. Those kinds of things that that can occur during that time. So those are just those 10 things. That doesn't take into consideration being, separated from your family and put in foster care, or, actually being a survivor of residential school, all those things that could happen. So that's one way to start to tease out what it really was, and that started all of this. And I remember when I went to my first therapy session, I totally unwilling, but somebody dragged me there because of an incident that happened in the community. We happened to have a group of counselors, and I was taking care of everybody else. And I said, no, I'm fine. I don't need to go. Let somebody else go. And it was a traumatic event that happened to the entire community. So she dragged me into this room and sat me down in front of this person. And the first thing that he asked me was, after he introduced himself, he said, so tell me about your childhood. How was your childhood? And I opened my mouth and I started crying for 45 minutes. I cried the whole time. I was in there. Every time I thought I pulled myself together, I tried to talk and I couldn't. And I had no idea where that was coming from. But eventually, talking about starting at the beginning, starting at the very beginning and working my way up, started to figure out what it was. And it wasn't just one thing. So beginning anywhere, I think, is a good start.
Mm-hmm.
Great answers. That's awesome. As I was listening to you talk, I was thinking about that too, about how the ACEs study kind of showed and revealed that it was kind of more of the experiences that we really can't see, that don't have really the scars and stuff, the emotional stuff that hits the spirit, and we think about that as Indigenous people that are, we're a spirit first. But yes, this is part of us as these physical bodies. But when we don't have our spirit nurtured in such day in and day out, that tends to stay with us, and we can't see those scars, but we can feel them. And like what you were saying earlier, we start covering those up by addictions and such. So great answer. I'm going to go back to another question here that we have here with some of our live viewers. And we have Timorous has a question. She says, how do patterns play a role in trauma, and how do we break them?
Mm-hmm.
I think that was partly answered a little bit earlier too, kind of within one of the other questions, but more of a specific question is like, how do the patterns play a role in trauma, and how do we break those?
It makes me recall the Women in Addictions conference Bev and I attended in the 1980s by Patrick Carnes, where he described a constellation of trauma responses. Trauma repetition. Trauma is circular in your nervous system for it to resolve. But in trauma repetition, you just can't complete the cycle. And it takes work for that to happen. Trauma bonding. We've all heard of trauma bonding. It's been themes in major motion pictures, and why we stay with abusers, why women will stay with their abuser. So trauma repetition, trauma bonds, trauma deprivation. I have, some of the behaviors that, in terms of patterns of possibly involved in traits like hoarding. I could be off base with that one, but they're repetitious behaviors that we adapt to in a patterned approach to life that affect our relationships. first our relationship to ourselves and then to others. And when we speak of dysfunction, that's the root of it, is the patterns of behavior that you can see in this constellation. So a better example of trauma deprivation is the old lady who worked in the library all her life, lived in a modest home, and when she passes away, they find her in her home, and opening the trunk of her car, they find $1 million in cash. That's not often heard about, but it's an illustration of the impact these patterns have on our behavior. And because some of them are at a level of another nervous system, we have a complex nervous system to serve our survival. And one of the elements of Beverly's training has touched on that cascade of neurotransmitters that are at work in messaging our body about trauma's impact, of imprinting the impact and embodying the impact of that trauma. And it doesn't have to be, as Bev pointed out, not some big, huge, serious event, one major incident. That it's usually a pattern of how you're being talked to. And what I love about when you're pregnant, the old ladies they told me the teachings are, don't go to a butchering. If you see an accident by the side of the road, don't look at it. Behaviors that are meant to protect the mother's nervous system from going into a full fight or flight and dumping these hormones into the bloodstream, and the baby's immature nervous system has no way of resolving that. And so in terms of transmission of traumas, there's subtleties at work at the level of our nervous systems. And it's at that level where you almost have to rewire your own nervous energy, because we are electric beings, full of energy. So how that gets patterned from trauma is one of the challenges of healing.
And I think there's a lot of investigation that needs to go on also in why a mother behaves a certain way, and the child is ignorant of that. And maybe even the mother doesn't know why she's actually behaving a certain way, other than that she has these anxieties and fears that she then visits upon the children. And I remember when my son-in-law was killed, and at 34, age 34, and my daughter reacted to that. She got up and she moved forward, and she went back to work after our 10-day feast. She did all that, and she went ahead. But in the meantime, when the kids couldn't go outside, and when they did go outside, she was flitting from one window to the next. Or if anybody went to visit, she was, can you go outside and check on the kids? Can you tell them to come back in? And she was continually pulling them back into the house. And so there's certain things that happen to us that we're not even conscious of. And how does that translate down to the kids and how they feel? Where do their insecurities and their anxiety then come from, that they don't even know why it was like that, until there's able to be a conversation, maybe, between them about, this is how I reacted when your father died, and you really don't need to be that anxious, about going outside or doing things or experimenting or, living. So there's a lot of different things that can happen and be repeated that way. And until it's brought to your attention, or until you seek it, you may not even be aware that you're doing that, affecting your children, that way. But it can be relieved. And I remember when I found out from my mother that about her sexual abuse that happened to her when she was a child, it was as if somebody lifted this 50-pound rock off of my shoulders, because all of her behaviors, all of her patterns of behavior made sense to me. How she was reacting to her own trauma. And she was in her 70s, I think, when she finally told me, and I was the second person in her life that she had talked to about it. So, it can be insidious, and it takes time, and it takes effort to reach those revelations and to find out where that's actually coming from. And most of the time, if it's trauma, it's not coming from you, and it's not your fault. You didn't cause it. You experienced it. And then it's what happened around that. How did we react to that? So all of these questions are great because they're, leading in one into the other. It's all one great big tapestry.
It is. It is. Those are some great feedback, guys, and for some great answers as well, too. We have another question. I'll probably take one more question before we kind of give some resources for our audience as well, too. In closing, we're already almost to the hour already, but I'm going to do one more question. This comes from Gail Small. So she says, how does Western patriarchy lead to continuing trauma of Indigenous women? Big question for a lot of the Indigenous women. Beautiful question, because I think we're all impacted by that as Indigenous women. So I don't know who would like to take that question.
Well,
I'll take a crack at it. There's a wonderful book that's a must read called Not in His Image. And it talks about a theology based on the idea of salvation. And the elements of it, there's about 3 or 4 that include the construction of a creator, male, supreme being with no matching female counterpart. And so when you look at the history of patriarchy, it comes out of the dominance and control in a historical moment that piece together elements of a narrative that was the subjugation of women and earth and anything that wasn't a man. And also this idea of a chosen people, someone people who are above other people. There are several other elements of this redemption theology that is so different from an Indigenous idea, philosophy, practice. And so I think it's in the reconstruction of the woman inside of our most sacred places. In our community, we've reconstructed the puberty rites from a perspective that's not patriarchal, but that does include very strongly the men, the fathers, the grandfathers, the brothers, the uncles. And so it's in those spaces where that kind of question is felt. What's the difference? The creating these powerful, creative, sacred spaces within our communities by reconstructing or maintaining our ceremonial practices, because we heal in relationship. And where we are in a committed relationship is in the societies that are part of our Indigenous communities, those who remember the ritualization of our life cycle. Sitting with my sister cousin Beverly in many kinds of contexts, such as that, I found great healing sharing our stories. and being able to move forward because of that shared sisterhood. And to me, that's the antidote to patriarchy. But then, of course, you have the other structures that go with it, the corporatocracies, the entitlement to power, and the whole movement right now to toward autocratic political traditions, such as we see throughout the U.S. and on national TV every night. The argument between these two. So, anyway, that's my crack at it.
Mhm.
Thank you. You want to add anything to that, Beverly?
No, I think that was wonderful, and also the extraction kind of mentality that um, pervades or is pervasive. Extracting resources from our Mother Earth, and I remember. And the harm that does, the harm that does to everyone. And I remember several years ago when, I don't know if you do, when they shot a missile, the government shot a missile into the moon to collect dust, to collect moon dust. They pierced her with a missile, and it just was so gross. I mean, it was just so repulsive to think that they would do something, but for just to collect dust, it was just unbelievable. But that kind of mentality, when you see it done on that level, and everything that Gaji mentioned, how they, I was waiting for her to talk about how they took over the birthing process, and did it to their convenience, where they were never invited, and so yeah, it's just quite harmful to all women and the woman, the mother that we walk on as well.
Right. Wow, thank you, ladies, for those beautiful answers. Gaji, we do have a question about the author of that book that you mentioned.
John Lamb Lash. John,
Okay.
You can find it on the internet. Not in his image, John Lamb Lash.
Okay, John Lamb Lash.
It's a decolonizing thinkers source book.
Awesome. Okay. I think we had some great questions, some great conversations tonight. In closing, how would you direct someone to, and we're all on our own different journeys of healing. Some of us are further along, some of us are just starting, some of us are somewhere in between. What are some resources that you might recommend to people who are just now starting out on that healing journey, learning about trauma, wanting to find out what type of traumatic experiences are impacting me today? What might you suggest as far as resources?
I think do you have the resource list?
We can post that in the comments as well too. We have our behind the scenes amazing team that can post those resources as well too. But I guess, do you want to suggest anything with our culture, and just kind of more of a general, non-specific type of way of healing?
I've never seen a talking circle go bad. I mean, it possibly has, but the way that I've experienced them here, they've always been respectful, of confidentiality, but respectful in sharing. And in the resource list, there's one that's virtual. Is it the Oglala Lakota Women's Healing Circle, and it's mind body medicine. They were so welcoming, and there were women from across Turtle Island that were much like this, that were participating in that in that in that talking circle. I thought that it was really nice, and in terms of looking into trauma, I also put Gabor Mate's um, wisdom of trauma link to his movie that really touches gently on all of these things that we've been talking about. But for myself, and I, you know, and I think for Gudgy as well, our women's groups, our sisters, our relationships that we make with one another are where I would seek, seek that kind ear, that person that can relate. I don't know what's available to everybody that's on this that's on this call, so I'm not sure. For me, it's our ceremonies, our ceremonial practices that have helped me immensely, in my own healing and in seeking out what services are available. And not everybody, you don't click with everybody, with every therapist that's out there, but I do find, that our women and our healing ways are best.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Gudgy, do you have any closing remarks? Or yes.
Yeah, well said, Bev. I just wanted to show you this, and I am not invested in Gabor Mate's work other than my extreme interest in how trauma works in our bodies. It's a companion booklet, and even though it's not the same energy you get when you're sitting by a sister in front of a sacred fire and you reveal things to one another that you needed to hear, you needed to know to situate what's going on with you better in your life. But there are elements of how our bodies work, what's more indigenous than the genes that are being affected by trauma, rewired, recalibrated. And understanding what has been turned on and turned off can be reversed. And there are healing modalities coming towards us that have to do with the reconstruction of new nervous pathways in the brain. Our people did have medicines for that kind of body level work. But this companion booklet of Gabor Mate's work on the wisdom of trauma that includes Indigenous people in it is a wonderful place to start. If you do nothing else after this workshop, watch the documentary, The Wisdom of Trauma.
Awesome. Great feedback, great resources that we can start with our audience with. So I want to say thank you for everyone for joining us this evening. And if you're watching at a later time, not during the live show, we also want to say thank you as well, too, for tuning in. I always feel like, people who are meant to watch this are meant to watch it. There's a message in it for you. Things don't happen by accident. So we want to say thank you in my language, Pilamaye, for joining in tonight for another amazing show with powerful matriarchs, Miss Gudgy Cook, Beverly Cook as well too. I want to say thank you to you ladies for your time, your energy, your wisdom, for sharing with our audience tonight. With everything that you have answered tonight. We're so grateful for that. In closing, we want to say, wherever you are in your journey of healing from your trauma, we want to encourage you to keep going. And I think that it's a journey that we're going to all take until our last day here on earth. We take our last breath. And so you are amazing. You're meant to be here, and we want to continue to encourage you to do that healing journey. Just like anyone, we say it's important for us to heal, but especially for our women. Our women are amazing. Our women are that bridge between the physical and the spiritual world that bring life into this world. Our first teachers are our mothers, our grandmothers, our aunts and such. And so because we have that gift, we also have that responsibility to do our own healing, to help. And that's how we help heal our world in general, heal our tribe, heal our people, heal society, and start with that healing with ourselves. Again, thank you again. My name is Jessie Taken Alive-Rencountre. I'm the host of the Women Empowerment Show with Social Distance Powell, also with our show here tonight with Spirit Aligned Leadership Program. Again, thank you so much. Join us look for the future dates for our next shows that we might have with our guests as well too. Thank you, and we'll catch you next time.
Ne ya gyungwe